For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rindy Zhang. I'm with the World Affairs Council. I just want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight, especially after such a big night last night. I hope some of you have gotten some rest where you will. And now on to our speaker tonight. Dr. Sinan Cidi is an expert on Turkish domestic politics and also foreign policy. Dr. Cidi was born in Turkey and educated in the United Kingdom. In addition to his teaching and researching at Georgetown, Dr. Cidi also serves as the executive director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown. He obtained his PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in the field of political science. So now please join me in welcoming the speaker for tonight, Dr. Sinan Cidi.
I've been told to take the bottle down. There we go. Excuse me. Okay. Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. And given the nature of the tumultuous events of last night, I am actually very honored to have an audience tonight. I thought most of you would want to just sort of stay home and, like my colleague and friend said, just catch up with some sleep. But you have, okay. But to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, your membership base, thank you for taking the time and resources to bring me out here. World Affairs Councils is something I deeply do believe in. I've done a lot of talks for a variety of councils across America, and I really do believe in their mission, in their informative service that they provide for a wide and diverse body of audience. For me, it's very selfish, actually. I get two things. I get usually a very receptive audience that's actually somewhat interested in what I have to say, as opposed to my daily routine when I actually do have to teach and nobody's interested in anything I have to say. And secondly, I get to see parts of the country which I otherwise would not get the opportunity to do so. A couple of weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to be in Montana, which was on my bucket list, and I was very, very grateful for that. And so 2 weeks later, finding myself here, again, very happy. So. Ominous country example to talk about from a variety of perspectives. I mean, if I was just addressing a Turkish audience or a Turkey enthusiastic audience, would be looking at Turkey from a particular angle in terms of where is Turkey's democracy headed. You could take it from a variety of perspectives. I think what I'm going to try and do is obviously situate Turkey from the perspective of a point of interest from an outgoing administration in this country as well as an incoming administration in terms of what's the relevance of Turkey in basically looking at the geostrategic map of the Middle East, which is obviously going to boggle the mindset of this and an incoming administration and possibly subsequent administrations. I think if you look at Turkey's present situation, I think as one single regional power which has a stake in the future and outcome of what happens in the Syrian civil war, as well as the defeat of, or the expected defeat of the Islamic State and the future stability of Iraq, we might have certain reasons for concern. And the case for looking at Turkey is from the perspective of just one individual country perspective. And there are multiple country perspectives that have a very visible stake in the game. Recently, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, much to my demise and sort of annoyance, asked the question, well, why should we not have a say in what happens in post-IS, Syria, and even possibly Iraq? The Americans do, so do the Russians. This is on our immediate southern border. Why don't we get a say in this? I will answer that, hopefully, but it's a well-put question, and Turkey is just one country that is staking a claim in the most volatile part of the region that's have been experiencing a considerable amount of turmoil ever since the beginning of the Arab Spring revolutions. It's also the case that, goes without saying, the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as the future of Iraq in post-liberation of these two countries from the Islamic State entity, is a question mark at best. No matter which perspective you look at this from, these are the most significant challenges that the global institutions, great powers, and regional powers are having a hard time getting to grips with and finding reasonable solutions to overcome. What are those problems? Well, the presence of the Islamic State in Syria, as well as large swaths of Iraq, although contained and now being pushed back quite considerably, they are presenting a variety of challenges that we as advanced capitalist states, or states also with advanced and capable militaries, do not necessarily have a reasonable strategy as to what comes after the liberation of, or the containment or the eradication of the Islamic State. The Islamic State and the future of post-Civil War Syria present nothing less than the most credible challenges to collective peace and security that the world has probably certainly seen since the end of the Cold War, but also possibly even going back further if you want to take back the clock. And I say that simply because I'll say what I'll say at the end first and hopefully build up that argument as I go along. In the absence of great power intervention, a concerted and well-planned, not necessarily military intervention, but a well-planned and well-executed strategy on the part of great powers, namely the United States and its NATO partners, in the case of Syria and Iraq, as far as the Islamic State is concerned, is resulting in the encroachment of particularistic interests by individual states such as Turkey, such as the Russian Federation, such as Arab republics, and also possibly Iran in the future. If you ask me, do I have a strategy of what that involves? I absolutely do not. But my primary argument that I would like to further and have you consider is to suggest that inaction, whether it's military or diplomatic or a combination of both, along with our allies in this country, has made the problem more entrenched and much, much worse in the last 3 years, because not necessarily of the encroachment and spread of the Islamic State, but more so the interaction of medium and great powers in the region, which is left unchecked. There is a proviso that goes along with this. I am a sympathizer of the Obama administration. I understand and am also frustrated with the lack of more concerted and more interactive and collaborative intervention in Syria in one way or another alongside our allies. But I also appreciate the fact that this is an impossible decision that this administration has faced since 2012, or even possibly before. Simply because, if you look at it from the administration's point of view, in 2012, the first problem that presented itself before the Obama administration was a second term. No president wanted to enter another war front in the Middle East whilst running for a second term. Like it or not, those are political realities that just about every president would have to face. The second reason, I think, is probably more poignant, and the one which doesn't alleviate my frustration for a lack of concerted effort, but it nevertheless, as a person, as a scholar of political science, makes me empathize with President Obama's reticence. And that is, what's the next step? And this is something that the President and his advisors have consistently asked. This is also something that came across in the Jeffrey Goldberg article that you may or may not have seen in the Atlantic magazine, which suggested that, okay, if the United States with or without its partners, intervenes in Syria to eradicate the Islamic State with possibly an incursion strategy, what's the next step? Do we then sit and build institutions, as we try to do in Iraq? Do we change the administration in Syria? Do we put up a democratic government or otherwise? What do we do? None of these questions to this day have any answers. Right now, we are singularly focused on ridding Mosul and Raqqa of Islamic State elements and hopefully the eradication of these entities from the entire landmass. What comes after is still a strategy that has not been formulated in any meaningful shape or form. It's frustrating, but it's also something that you can empathize with, I'm sure, simply because I don't know if there is a good answer to this. So, in the absence of that, in the absence of strategy and actual plan on the ground, you have seen Russian military escalation build up in the Middle East and possibly further that we have not seen since the end of the Cold War. Sensing that the United States was not going to be involved in any shape or form in containing Islamic State resurgency or the Assad regime very much taking the fight to the streets, the Russians implemented two big strategies. The test balloon was basically the annexation of large swaths of present-day Ukraine and also right now Crimea, but more so absolutely committing military assets into present-day Syria in the form of air bases and troops and special forces, which probably are not likely to go away after the end of the Syrian civil war, one way or another. That is massive escalation of Russian military resurgence that we have not seen, and it's very much has a foothold in the Middle East. You also have other regional powers, which are smaller powers, obviously, and Turkey's one of the loose cannons. Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States. It's one of nearly a founding member of NATO. It's been a member since 1952 and has been involved in some of the most comprehensive and vital NATO operations in the organization's and the alliance's history. To this day, Turkish troops are present in Afghanistan. There's still peacekeeping operations in Kosovo, and they also provide training and assistance to rebel fighters, possibly in Syria. Turkey plays and has consistently played a vital part in NATO. It is not doing that right now for a variety of reasons. Okay. And its status as a credible NATO partner country, the second largest military in NATO after the United States. Its credentials as a credible NATO ally have been called into question and possibly disrepute. And for some of this is valid reasons. The reasons why Turkey's membership and reliability as a Western ally, whether it's a strategic partner of the United States or a member of NATO, the reason why it's being called into question is because due to continued intransigence, inactivity and lack of willingness of the United States and other NATO powers to take bold and well-planned strategy in Syria, then Turkey has started to follow its own policy and agenda in Syria. Now, the United States government has been very, very critical of this, and I think those criticisms are well leveled. And if you look at the level of the relationship between the US and Turkey, this is the lowest level that relations have ever fallen to, probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1961. This is something that the Erdogan administration in Turkey, and as well as the Obama administration, are not able to basically come to terms with. These two administrations are basically done with each other. They were done after about 2013, and it's not going anywhere productive. And the reason is this. Turkey implored and pledged the Western alliance, suggesting that it was the only country which could possibly, in the words of Erdogan actually, completely compel Assad to back down from butchering his own citizens and basically coming to terms with a power transition. After given a certain amount of time to negotiate this, and seemingly failing to do it, not on Turkey's part, but basically because the Assad regime decided that it was better to continue fighting, Erdogan was basically left burned. Therefore, Turkey's entire strategy over Syria after that point is basically to get rid of Assad. Turkey is in its entire republican history since 1923 has never engaged in a process or policy of regime change, except this time. The Turks have been hell-bent on getting removal of Assad since basically 2013. And once the Turks made it known that the Assad regime burned them, at that time the US was very much on board with this policy, that Assad had to go. And the Turks saying, well, how are we going to do this? And between 2013 and 2014, what you saw is a kind of tap dance. Washington was egging Ankara on to take on Assad militarily, and Ankara was saying, well, okay, I'm happy to be involved in this, but you've also got to have a helping hand in this. This whole business of red lines being put out by Washington that were crossed and subsequently never acted upon. This very much drove a wedge between Erdogan and the Obama administration. Seeming levels of frustration, on one hand, each power egging on the other, saying, you go first, no, you go first. After this point, what you see is Turkey very much taking the task of taking matters into its own hand. If the United States is not going to get involved, then we will do what it takes to get rid of the removal of Assad and the imposition of a Sunni-friendly government in Syria that we can get on with. And then they will be compelled to work with us. Now, nobody assumed up until this time that Assad could dig in and survive as long as he did. And Erdogan's assumption was that given logistical assistance, weapons, hospital treatment, intelligence, air cover, what have you, to rebel fighters in Syria, that Assad's journey would be complete in about 12 months. Obviously, that didn't materialize. And in doing so, Turkey essentially, or the Erdogan regime essentially gave assistance, support, and logistical supplies to all forms of radical entities in Syria, including, at the time, Jabhat al-Nusra, and possibly turned a blind eye to the activities of the Islamic State in northern Syria and beyond. And it is this which led many in Washington, as well as skeptics in Turkey, of the Erdogan government to say, what kind of NATO ally is this in terms of allowing the very people that we're trying to end being helped by a NATO ally? And that's a fair question. But it should also be borne in mind that at the time, what you're looking at is the defeat of the Islamic State, even possibly up as late as last 3 or 4 months. The defeat of the Islamic State was a distant second priority for every single power in the region except the United States. And the US administration's problem was more of an intellectual one. What comes after a military assault in Syria? How much will it cost? Do we commit troops? If so, for how many years? What is the mission goal and parameters? Okay. And these are some things that you may agree with or disagree with on the part of Obama. Some people have called him weak. I've been frustrated as an observer, but frustration on my part has been tempered by empathy. Because it's an administration for me that has made me realize, well, those are difficult questions that require answers before committing hundreds of thousands of troops that may not necessarily have an end mission in sight that costs us in this country hundreds of thousands of, well, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars probably, and subsequently also loss of lives. But in that sphere, what you see in the Turkish case is very much leveraging of Turkey's own interests in the absence of US and NATO collaboration. What makes the problem even deeper and more divisive, and this is something that the new administration in Washington, I don't know how they will approach this, because it's a very complicated one. Turkey since then has become politically itself very, very unstable. As many of you are aware, on July 15th of this year, factions of the Turkish armed forces tried to topple the elected government of Turkey, presumably as well as Tayyip Erdogan, who I'm sure was the real target of this. This coup has obviously failed, and since then a considerable amount of attempts have been made on the part of the government to do two things. One, to basically rein in the would-be coup makers. Who are they? Which factions of the military? Which officers? Were there civilian elements to it? If so, let's round them up. You see massive purges and detentions from the Turkish military. And secondly, what you're also seeing, which is leading to Turkey's growth in instability, is the purging for Erdogan's own political gains of hundreds of thousands of civil servants, academics, journalists, which has become unprecedented. On the first note, the purging from the Turkish military has had or will likely have very unpredictable consequences. Approximately one half of Turkey's command and control ability has been either purged or detained. Approximately 48% of senior generals and admirals have been detained, purged, or dismissed from the ranks. Remember, this is NATO's second largest military. And Turkey presently has military incursions and offensives currently engaged in battle, in combat, in northern Syria. Turkey's Air Force, just about half the entire pilots have been purged, dismissed, or detained, which means that Turkey's military has a capacity problem. And this is worrying people in the circles of power in Washington, to the extent that, to what extent can Turkey really prosecute or help us prosecute the continuing war against the Islamic State? The coup attempt has also had very troubling ramifications for the bilateral relationship between the United States and Turkey. Although Turkey has been a strategic partner of the United States and a critical ally of NATO since 1952, as I've indicated, relationship between the two countries has never fallen so low as it has done so until now. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Erdogan, following the night of the coup, I would say quite understandably, if I was trying to be overthrown as an individual, has become extremely paranoid as to who's after him. On the night of the coup, several world leaders or regional leaders called him and condemned the coup. The first amongst them was the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. The second one was the Iranian president. And thirdly, it was the British Prime Minister, as these were unfolding. No other country from the European Union, let alone the United States, called Erdogan and basically condemned the coup. The State Department, or Secretary Kerry, waited 48 hours before urging for peace and stability, as opposed to condemning the coup in the country. And it took another 45 days before Vice President Biden visited Ankara. From that perspective, what you see is a big question mark in the mind of Erdogan, suggesting to what extent is the United States behind this, or involved in this. Or in his own words, he said that both the Europeans and the Americans would have been very happy if I had been toppled. Someone who's been in power for approximately 15 years, who is doing everything to centralize power and undercut democratic governance structures in Turkey, having just also faced off a massive coup d'etat attempt, you could probably understand that a person of his stature would probably be just a little bit more than paranoid. But it's a very isolated position, because right now he looks at his weakest moment politically and looks and sees that he doesn't necessarily have the support of Turkey's quote-unquote traditional allies. And since then, what we are seeing since the summer months of this year, Turkey really starting to question, at the same time leverage its position vis-à-vis its Western allies. If Turkey is going to play ball and be considered a Western partner, then the United States and its allies have to produce. It's got to take its sensitivities into account, otherwise Turkey doesn't play ball. So what are those sensitivities? Well, the first one, the extradition of the would-be coup maker. Turkey is convinced, and probably to a large extent it's probably true, in my opinion, that a cleric by the name of Fethullah Gülen, who resides in Pennsylvania, who was once a political ally of Erdogan, and whose movement was intricately involved in the governance of Turkey, and whose members staffed government institutions such as the judiciary, as well as the police forces. They were implicit as also members of the military, Gülen sympathizers. Were complicit in trying to take Erdogan down. Erdogan wants the United States to extradite this man, period. It's not going to happen simply because Turkey cannot produce the evidence which will allow a district court judge in Pennsylvania to make the initial ruling. Even if that judge approved it, Gülen's people would likely appeal that to federal court. If that gets turned out, and Gülen is a wealthy person, he could appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this has really started to sour relations. And on top of the coup timing, with the US not backing Erdogan up, what you also saw that was left unchecked or uncriticized by Erdogan is the pro-Erdogan media in Turkey becoming completely unbridled. Approximately 80 to 85% now of media in Turkey has been co-opted by Erdogan and Erdogan sympathetic. And what you see is an unparalleled attempt to slam and ratchet up anti-American sentiments amongst the Turkish population. And the more that Erdogan doesn't get his way with the extradition of Gülen, and the more the press goes on ahead with lambasting against the Americans for hiding coup conspirators, the more strengthened he becomes domestically. The more he becomes strengthened domestically, the more that the United States will have to deal with him. He's not going anywhere. So he's playing a very, very long and smart game at solidifying his position after the coup. In that sense, the second thing that's really Turkey's leveraging and serving to sour relations between the United States and Turkey is very much leveraging further wants out of the US. If we're going to liberate Syria from the Islamic State as well as Iraq, okay, fine. Turkey will be a partner and we will get involved. There is a price tag though. There will not be the formation of any Kurdish state or entity along my southern border, period. And I'll tell you this from the outset, Turkey will get its way on that, without question. Turkey has been able to leverage that out of the United States or any other NATO power since the first Gulf War. The whole reason why we had Operation Provide Comfort and no-fly zone over Iraq was basically because Turkey demanded the fact no Kurdish state should be established in its northern part. Turkey can leverage that simply because it occupies the highest or the most prestigious piece of strategic real estate, probably in the world, that concerns the US. And if the US wants to continue sending warplanes to bombard IS targets, the best place to do that is from Incirlik Air Base located in southeast Turkey, probably less than 100 miles from IS targets. So Erdogan is very cognizant of this. The relationship between Turkey and the US has become very transactional. You got to pay to play. Excuse me. And as a result of that, you have lots of folks in Washington, in the Obama administration, the State Department, the Pentagon saying, this is not how allies behave. And Erdogan saying, well, okay, this has been a frustrating relationship for the 4 years. I think both sides have really misread each other, and you've now got a man that's hell-bent on political survival in Turkey, that's really leveraging every ounce of what he can take to maintain his own position domestically, get international powers to take him seriously, and to balance that off against the United States, he also engages very, very cordially now with the Russian Federation. If you remember last year, Turkey shot down a Russian jet because it encroached upon Turkish airspace, but mainly it was Erdogan's message to the Russians saying, there is a finite role that you can play in Russia, in Syria, without me having a say-so. The toll and the hit that that took on the Turkish tourism industry, agricultural export industry, business-to-business relations, whatever you may call it, has since resulted in Erdogan mending ties with Russia and making a very public go of it. Turkey has recently signed numerous defense contracts with the Russian Federation. Tourism has been re-established, and then once again you see Erdogan and Putin shaking hands. Again, basically a good show of a display to Turkey's Western partners, suggesting that Turkey has options. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a very precarious situation. You've got an Erdogan regime in Turkey right now, which since July, although looks very fragile and possibly isolated from its international partners, has steadily been building a very solid domestic position vis-à-vis calling out its American and European partners for not backing him, and the slur of anti-Americanism, anti-European sentiment has basically made Erdogan's popularity ratings in Turkey, or in this country as we say, approval ratings, really go up. He's probably polling about the 60% right now. So he has a real solid base of domestic support. The relationship between Turkey and the United States has become extremely transactional, whereby one side possibly is leveraging to the full extent in order to get what it wants, so that its security concerns are met before Turkey plays ball with dealing with radical terrorism in the form of eliminating Islamic State from Iraq and Syria. How will Erdogan be dealt with, or how will Turkey and the United States go on from this? Today, President Erdogan, cannot confirm it, I was looking this up before I came, but I think he may have already had a conversation with President-elect Trump. One of the first people to speak to him. You're looking at two administrations who are possibly, well, I can confirm it on the Erdogan side. Erdogan is a very bullish person. He also has 15 years of diplomatic, political, and foreign policy experience now. When he came to power in 2003, as Prime Minister, he had seldom been out of the country. He's very cleverly manipulated and leveraged Turkey's interest, or his interest in the region, to both solidify Turkey's interest as well as his own domestic position in Turkey very, very cleverly. We also might have a new president that, based on campaign rhetoric or campaign behavior, a situation whereby he may not wish to tolerate Erdogan's leveraging. So you might have the case of two alphas in one of the most strategically volatile parts of the world, which US has very key interests, as well as NATO, not being able to come to terms with each other. And this is quite a scary prospect. And this is while still there are 50 nuclear weapons, 50 nuclear warheads on Turkish soil, US nuclear warheads. And also ongoing military operations in Syria on the part of Turks and the Americans. Where does this leave us in terms of a post-Civil War and post-IS Iraq and Syria? That I honestly find very hard to put down on paper. I honestly do not have an opening as to what the map looks like, who administers post-IS Mosul and post-IS Raqqa, much less post-Civil War Syria. What we do know is that we have a new administration here. We have more military presence possibly gearing up to implement some of these strategies. But what we do not have is the collaboration of both NATO and the United States with an overarching plan that will help possibly eradicate some of the gravest instabilities that I've tried to allude to, certainly since the end of the Cold War. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Dr. Jilly, for the talk. And now I'm going to be moving on to the Q&A session. And I will start with a question on the coup. And earlier you mentioned that the Turkish government suspects that Gulen is behind the coup that took place in the summer. What's your personal take on this? And do you think more officials will be arrested under suspicion?
Thank you for that question. What you see in Turkey right now is two 400-pound gorillas going hammer and tongs at each other. The Turkish political landscape has become the battleground of Turkey's two biggest heavyweight politicians. One has a position as President Erdogan, and the other is Fethullah Gülen, who resides in Pennsylvania, but his movement since at least 2012, 2013, has been motivated to essentially topple Erdogan one way or another. Initially severely undercut his ability and mandate to rule, mainly because as a movement who had a buy-in, who had access to the Erdogan government, felt that it had a voice in policy, which Erdogan subsequently rebuked, and the coup expression on the part of the Gülen movement, which was put into motion, was the most significant attempt to try and derail and undermine the Erdogan government. Unfortunately, what has happened since then, and this has been steadily building up since the Gezi protests of 2013, what you're starting to see is a usurpation of usurpation of power, and the degradation and mining of Turkey's democratic institutions. Never did I imagine that one man and his political will takes such a short time to dismember and dismantle Turkey's democratic structures. Now, Turkey is not the United States. It's not the United Kingdom in terms of democratic governance structures. But it was the only functioning democracy in the Muslim world and a candidate country for the European Union accession. It did have strong state institutions. Its constitutional court is not reminiscent of the Supreme Court here, but nevertheless served as an effective check on executive power for a while, for a good while. Opposition political parties, free discussion in the press, all these things that were hallmarks of Turkey's democracy, and more importantly, free and fair elections since 1915 and a peaceful transfer of power that Turks always rallied, except with military interventions aside. And unfortunately, what you're seeing is within a very short space of time, some very time-tested and very old institutions being torn apart. My point would be, democracies are fragile.
So now moving away from Turkey's domestic politics a little bit and back to what's happening in Iraq and Syria right now, do you think Turkey will make efforts to slow down the successes and taking of territory by the Kurds from ISIS? And also a follow-up question to that, what's Turkey's end game in Aleppo? And they're attacking Kurdish fighters. Does Turkey want to annex northern Syria in order to expand Greater Turkey?
Wow. Those are very good questions. This is my opinion. Turkey's end game in Aleppo, bombing Kurds, is basically to show and constantly show to its US partner, saying, I will be a partner to you as we take out the Islamic State, but I will continue demonstrating that you will under no circumstances countenance the formation of a Kurdish state entity, unification of cantons, whatever you want to call it, under any circumstance, and I will bomb YPG targets and you will suffer it. That's essentially Turkey's idea in that. And it's, if you speak to officials, people who work on Turkey in any, US government agency, especially the Pentagon guys, they will tell you we don't have options. We absolutely need Turkey's cooperation. It's not simply just a matter of an air base. Right? You can find those. There's been a couple of articles that suggest that you can go and put up air bases everywhere else. It's 60 plus years of military to military conversation understanding how both militaries work. Turkish military staff officers talking to American Turkish staff officers. Planning, implementation, intelligence sharing. These are really old mechanisms. If the United States goes nuclear and gets rid of the airbase, you're not just getting rid of, the US will not just be getting rid of an airbase. You're getting rid of, a country which can prove to be vital in a whole plethora of security concerns that the US will continue and likely to have. That's why the Obama administration is suffering Erdogan. So that, the end game vis-a-vis Kurds, Turkey is likely to be a partner in now the unfolding operation in Raqqa. In fact, a gentleman here today just showed me an article that came out suggesting that Turkey, is not going to tolerate a Kurdish presence in the Raqqa operation, and that probably makes more sense than Mosul because Raqqa is a traditionally Arab city. This is not something that the Turks are willing to negotiate over, and are making it very, very clear that they will not allow the participation of Kurds or Kurdish elements such that these entities will be unified in the formation of a state. Turkey is not going to do it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier in your talk that Turkey is hell-bent on removing Assad. How does this square with their movement towards more cooperation and reconciliation with Russia?
So Turkey's actually, for the last 6 months, has basically walked away from the idea of let's get rid of Assad now. I think Turkey will play along if it's brought to the table as a country or as a power which has a stake in the game, a name in the game, and that its notion of Kurdish security entities as well as possibly Shia elements in terms of governance structures being limited are taken seriously in any sort of resolution settlement. So, and that's a problem for, that in that sense, it can work with the Russians on this. And the extent to which Turkish-Russian rapprochement was anything more than simplistic can be seen here. The Russians will want a friendly regime installed in Syria no matter what. The Turks are absolutely not crazy about that. And therefore, on the longer strategic sort of vision for the Middle East, Turkey and Russia are always likely to be sort of more distant, but I don't know if they can tiptoe around that with just trade relations.
I think some of our members are interested with the recent development last night. How do you think Trump will approach the civil war in Syria and also Turkey, and also with that, there are similarities between the styles of Trump, Erdogan, and also Putin. Do you see potential for all of them to unite in a coalition against ISIS? And what about Trump enabling Erdogan's suppression of political rivals through weapons?
So this is my magic 8-ball that I brought with me. Here it is. Let's shake it. So President-elect Trump, if we go by what he campaigned on, that's the only thing I can go on because I honestly don't know. Two things, yes, we can go by what he campaigned on, and the second thing that it will be determined by, essentially, I guess, would be what does his Secretary of State look, who will it be, and what kind of team will they build in terms of the undersecretaries, and that should give us a better sort of vision in terms of how they're going to approach the Middle East as well as ISIS, as well as. But if we go by the campaign promises, one thing that sticks out to my mind is, I don't know to what extent he was serious about this. Maybe it was just campaign talk. That the US doesn't really see the inherent value of NATO anymore, and if countries want the US to be involved in the security of and protection of the United States, then they would have to possibly pay for this. Now, he is on the record saying that he will end ISIS. I don't know what the specific policy opening for that will be. Will it mean ground troops being committed? Will it mean partnership with allies? Will it be working through NATO? Would the president-elect, would he be comfortable basically working through the channels of NATO as opposed to just US power being projected? I honestly don't know. What I would suggest is, and I guess what the Turks are most interested in, they're going to wait to see who the Secretary of State is, what the sort of undersecretaries look like, who are the basic advisors, and what's going to emerge in the next 2 months before we can have a more accurate assessment as to what that will entail. Right now it's too early to tell, I think.
Okay, still on Erdogan, what do you think about his, what's sort of the vision that he's playing of himself? I mean, in terms of playing a larger role in the whole region, and does he see himself creating a new caliphate in the future?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think Erdogan's interested in creating caliphate. I do think Erdogan's very interested in creating a position for himself where he is unrivaled in the region. That might be a pipe dream, but it may not be. I mean, Turkey's military capacity is significant. Its economic might is comparatively in the region significant. Put to good usage in terms of good governance structures in Turkey and basically the railing of the military following the coup, then Erdogan stands a good shot of basically having a dominant position if he's able to maintain a manageable relationship with the United States. Unfortunately, the way that Erdogan's going down the road is right now, last week, several members of one of the opposition parties in Turkey's parliament, the Kurdish MPs, were arrested and put in jail. Unprecedented, we haven't seen that since the early 90s. Turkey's equivalent, I would argue, of the New York Times was raided and several of its journalists were detained and now put in jail pending trial. Calling Turkey a democracy right now is a luxury. The US and the EU are basically condoning it because Erdogan is able to leverage this out of them. If Erdogan doesn't cooperate, then he turns on the tap of 3 million refugees into Europe, and if the US doesn't cooperate, well, the fight against the Islamic State becomes more troubled. I don't think it's about creating a caliphate for Erdogan. I think it's about getting the entire ball players to respect him, realize his pivotal role that he holds in the region, and that if they do not, then he has the power to make people's lives the US and EU's life very, very uncomfortable. For me, my interpretation of Erdogan has always been the centralization of power. It's never been about, as far as I can tell, the Islamization of Turkey. He's an Islamist politician, no doubt about it. But what's more interesting for Erdogan is the use of Islamo-nationalist rhetoric to fire up voters, to ratchet up the notion of anti-Americanism and anti-EU policies, to really solidify up and fire up his voter base and the Turkish voting base, such that he can hold a presidency in Turkey that is unquestioned, that has a powerful support base, in a way that is socially conservative, possibly. I don't think it's about Islamism in Turkey, I think it's about authority.
Okay, and the last question, or last two questions of the evening from, I'm going to butcher this name, Fuad Adra. The first name, again, asking you to roll your 8-ball here. Is there going to be a post-ISIS? And the second question is, I think people here are interested in hearing more about your take of one of the major drivers of instabilities in the region, Iran, and what you think of their role in the big picture.
Yeah, great questions. Very good questions. I think there will be a post-IS, definitely, but that doesn't really mean a lot to us, and it shouldn't, because it doesn't essentially, in my opinion, get rid of the fundamental nature of the problem. The reason that the Islamic State arose is because we invaded Iraq in 2003, period. if you want to take it back and stop, if we move back from what's Turkey doing, what's it leveraging, what are the Russians, why are they encroaching, what's Iran doing? Yeah, we can look at all this. Fact of the matter remains: if we didn't invade Iraq in 2003, we wouldn't have this radically motivated Sunni insurgency, which then basically morphed itself into the Islamic State come and take such a bold position in the region. In that sense, if we militarily remove the Islamic State, okay, does that mean that's the end of such activity in the world or the region? I can say for sure, absolutely not. Yesterday it was Al-Qaeda, today it's Islamic State, which we're more afraid of. Tomorrow, who knows what it will be. We're not addressing the fundamental problems and question marks of regional stability, development, democratization, access to clean water, education by half a dozen of states in the region which are deeply impoverished. And as long as that continues, and as long as the world doesn't care, this will continue. And it will continue to escalate, and it will find new versions to morph itself into. I say that with 100% certainty. That's not an if, it's just a when. And it will continue to present military challenges, and administrations who are interested in immediate political gains will continue to just tiptoe around the issue as opposed to take more bolder and substantive measures against it in terms of global engagement. The second question was?
Iran's role.
Oh, Iran's role in the region. I mean, Iran's role, you can see it as an agitator, but from the position of Iran, I mean, they now have a position and, a unique opportunity of having concluded the nuclear deal to basically do two things. Absolutely. I mean, they would like to project interest into and strategic interest onto the regional map, and they do possess the potential to do that. If they're smart, then they can go about it in the way of more economic engagement. One of the things that Iran really very much has a huge potential to achieve is massive exports of its energy resources, at the same time a very vibrant, a very well-educated middle class and working industrial labor force, which can engage with Western corporations if it chooses to open that up. Just the projected trade between Turkey and Iran is in the next 10 years could thought to top about $500 billion. It's huge. And Iran is in a very advantageous position whereby it does not have an indebted state. It really does not, which against Turkey is unheard of. Turkey is the most economically prosperous country in the region, except with an up-and-coming Iran, if it should choose to go down the route. It very much depends, in my opinion, on what track of engagement the Iranian regime decides to go down. If it wants to go down an economic engagement and spread its wings and become economically vibrant and engaged with the Europeans and longer term possibly with the Americans, great. You're looking at a very interesting potential to develop. If you're looking at a more sectarian and strategic engagement at the detriment of the United States and more sort of Machiavellian in that sense, then that's going to cause more brows to be ruffled, I think, and we don't know where that could go.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Jidi.
Thank you.